Now, welcome. We are now complete for this workshop, which will be a bit technical, I guess, because here we are going to talk about the intricacies of economic governance. Just for those who want to ask questions using the application Slido, the hashtag is G780, so G Golf 780. And the general hashtag is postgrowth 2018. So voila. This said, I will launch the session. So it's quite obvious that we have a problem, a dual problem of rising inequalities and rising ecological footprint, that if we want to tackle it, we need then to gear our governance in order to get results. I'm coming from business, and I remember that one of the mottos I heard most was what gets measured gets done. So if you don't measure things and if you don't translate them into targets, well, they don't get the attention that they need. But of course, we have targets that are written in the European treaties, and we have the governance around those targets written into EU law. That is called the six-pack, the two-pack, whatever. We have a whole array of legislations that determine how we govern. So the question is, how do we adapt our regulatory framework in order to achieve the desired results? Because I do not believe that anyone here sees the rising inequalities or the rising ecological footprint as a desirable outcome. Knowing the people who are here around the table, I know this is not the case. So the question is, what do we do? So in order to speak about that, we are going to have three speakers and an exchange with you, of course. The first speaker has a special place in this conference, and that's Marco Buti. Marco Buti is Director General of the DG EcFin. And actually, when I told you yesterday the genesis of this conference, he played a role because he was the first in the Commission to whom I submitted the idea, and the initial response was rather encouraging and say, yeah, we should engage into this dialogue. So I mentioned you yesterday in my introduction, and I repeat that today because indeed I think that you helped making this dialogue just happen. So Marco is very close to the European economic governance because his Directorate General is the part of the Commission that drives the economic governance. Even if other DGs are part of it, the driving seat is with DG EcFin. We'll have Gaël Giraud. Gaël is currently Chief Economist, right, of the French Development Aid Agency, the official agency, but Gaël Giraud is also an economist. Well, you might say it's obvious if you are the Chief Economist, who wrote a number of books and who also presided over the translation of one of my favorites, that is Debunking Economics, L'imposture économique, written by Steve Keen. And then we will have Elisabeth Hege from the IDDRI, a French research institute with whom we have already worked on quite a few occasions. And so we expect an initial dialogue between the three. I would say if you could keep your initial remarks to 15, 20 minutes max, so that we can get into the exchange with the floor. Marco, you're first, and then it's going to be Gaël and Elisabeth who will close the initial round.
Okay, merci.
Marco.
Merci, Philippe. I have a few slides. You can see them there. Okay. I think in conferences like that, and I was fond actually to recall when we had the first chat in Place de Luxembourg,
exactly.
In front of a nice
in
beer.
A sunny day.
On a sunny day like this one. And indeed, I think it's, the discussion there was that we should try to have a dialogue between, let's say, more mainstream and more, let's say, unorthodox views. And my feeling was that this is useful also because there is a rethinking within the mainstream. So yeah, I think exactly. the divide, the sharp divide between the two, I think is not warranted anymore. So there is a dynamic there which is not concluded. So I think there is a chance also to better understand and come to some, let's say, I would say, well, agreed principle, or at least clarity on matters where one disagrees, but on the basis of not ideological divides, but I think more let's say, factual element and analytical element. Disagreements will remain, obviously. And I say this because, I mean, in my own shop, I see we are very much involved in the, currently in the, pushing forward the completion of the architecture of economic and monetary union. We have an important rendezvous for the Euro area summit in December, where there are some deliverables to be fulfilled. And I can see, I mean, at the end of the day, the basic problems that why it is so heavy, so tiring, and so cumbersome to move forward the agenda is that we do not have a common narrative. So there continues to be a sharp divide in the reading of the financial crisis. There are those who continue to read this as essentially a fiscal crisis. Others, and I think this is, I think, not the right interpretation in my view, though, and we can discuss it later, I have something to document this, even though you have, one has to distinguish between cause and effects, and the high public debt we find now is more the effect than the cause. You are still left with how to deal with this heavy burden now that you cannot disregard, even if that has been the result of the crisis, in part also the policy responses, and not the original sin, so to say. So sharp divides on reading of the crisis. In my own view, and I think this is something that should try to help design what is the forward path also. I think the crisis is essentially born into misallocation of resources in the good times before the crisis. So misallocation of capital and labor, if you want to take it, if you take a narrow view, and possibly if you take a broader view of matters that are keen to your, close to your heart, also related to misallocation of resources more generally. And when we had the sudden stop coming in 2008, 2009, then the problems which were below the surface, helped by let's say, the fuel of low interest rates and flow of credit to more peripheral economy, which ended up in the wrong place instead of boosting productivity and wealth creation, came to the fore, and then we were left, I think, with this big problem. So I think this is I'm saying because. This dialogue is needed, and unless we manage to find some common analytical underpinning, I think it's very difficult to bring forward the things, because at the end of the day, if you don't have that, then what happens is that ideology tends to prevail, and then those who are stronger, thinking about in particular member states, they tend to have their own way. And then we don't find the right answers. Now, in conferences like this, it's good to go back to basics. So I have a first slide, which I don't know how many. Okay, someone is taking care. Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, if you think about public finances, the classic reference is Musgrave, 1959. No, it's the theory of public finances. Still, are quite influential. It's one of the founding fathers of public finances, and he identifies the roles of government. So in very broad terms, the roles of government is essentially three. So you have governments fostering the right allocation of resources, and this is related essentially to growth and potential growth going forward. You have the equity concerns. So the first is efficiency, the second is equity, so the redistribution. And then you have the stabilization. So how you respond to the cyclical upturns and downturns and to shocks. Now, what I have indicated here is in the triangle here for each couple, be the trade-offs, or so substitutability or complementarity, so trade-offs or synergies. And what I have put here in bold, maybe you can spot it from the audience, is what, let's put it in mainstream literature, or the classic views are. So what you have clearly, and you hear it, I mean, in textbooks, is on the allocation redistribution line, the perception is that there is a trade-off. So that is what the literature tend to point to. So if you do something which is favors redistribution by increasing taxes, higher marginal tax rates, this affects the creates bad incentives and reduces the efficient allocation, reduces growth. This is the traditional, let's say, mainstream view. Recently, actually, you have, and that is the plus behind there, you have views actually which point to a complementarity of this. If, for instance, you use the taxes in order to foster proper education, your healthcare, and I think so. You have also the possibility to actually establish synergies there. But I think one has to look at that more closely, and it is not the prevailing view on the literature. Along the axis redistribution stabilization, here the view is that there is a synergy here. So what you get is that you have stronger redistribution, you have a higher progressivity, and these tax and benefit systems, which are more progressive, when there is a shock, they help also to stabilize disposable income. We have to be careful there, because there are certain elements actually that and that is the minus, in a smaller font there, because certain element of tax and benefit systems which actually may work against stabilization, in particular if you have shocks which is more of the supply side, which requires reallocation of resources rather than stabilization of the resources where they are employed. So there is a risk there also. And then there is a genuine trade-off. I think the literature here does not point in one direction or another, is on the between allocation and stabilization. I think you can find arguments on both sides. So what should we do in terms of orientation of our economic policies is to try to move policies to come closer to the plus, to the pluses along the three dimensions. So this is in order to characterize a bit conceptually the way we should look at things. Now, why did I put Musgrave plus in the title? Because Musgrave pure, it is the three here. It did not talk about sustainability. So it was essentially, let's say shorter term issues. I think more focus on the flows than on the stocks. That was the Musgrave. So if you take actually sustainability, I think, I don't know if you click, can you click again? Okay, there we are. So we have I put the sustainability around that because you can actually, and here I put fiscal sustainability because I focus on that stability pact, but we can put sustainability more generally, and I think the same argument applies. I think the unsustainability threats sharpen the trade-offs between these. So if you get into a situation in which you have your public finances, your public debt, there is risk to get out of control, I think you have, it's more difficult to get to the positive synergies between these. We can discuss that, I don't have time now, but I think keeping your public finances, I think, under control in normal times, I think helps along the various poles, but also in the interplay between the poles. We can move to the next slide, and this is something that we have done our work ourselves at the Commission. It is, I take it from a published paper, but we have found we have similar results ourselves. So what I show here is that if in year one you have a shock, either normal cyclical downturns or normal recessions, Or when you see it in red here, this is shocks following financial crisis. So following credit booms, boom and bust, financial crisis. Then you can see the recovery of GDP over the years for low debt. Here, low debt is around 15 to 20% debt to GDP ratio. Average debt is between 50 and 60. This is the average of the sample here of industrialized countries. This is, it looks episode going back many, many years. So it's this in average. Then you have high debt countries, which is here in the paper is 85% plus. You may remember the discussions a couple of years ago on the paper was 90% Rogoff, etc., with a mistake in the calculation. But anyway, so this and the causality of effects. But this is the, and what you can see here clearly is that the response to the shock, when you start from sounder public finances, I think is actually better than when you have high debt. And there, when you have high debt in particular, with the, in the case of financial crisis, in which, and the experience here of the crisis is very telling, you have the boundary between private and public debt becomes very thin in financial crisis. So what you have countries which start with low public debt, which all of a sudden, take Ireland, for instance, I think is the quintessential, Spain at the other start with, and because of help to the banks, because you have to save the financial system from collapse, then this private becomes public debt. If you do not have the room for, this is the same in terms of the stock, and then you have also the possibility to react with discretionary policy or letting automatic stabilizers play. So both on the flow and on the stock, you have it helps to have room for maneuver to start with. And you can see here with countries which start with low debt, financial crises are not materially different than normal cyclical downturns. I think this is it's a quite important conclusion. So what we insist on in our recommendations, that to put your public finances in order, has in mind stability concerns, but has in mind also to create a room for maneuver for let's say responding to crises when they come. And this is covers many countries, European countries and non-European countries, but you have also, an anecdotal experience from Europe. Take the Nordic countries, which are those who respect very strictly, and they insist actually respect very strictly the fiscal rules that we have. At the same time, they can lessen the trade-off in not shifting to the synergies in the triangle I have presented you before. So this is fiscal prudence and stabilization, so from the circle to that particular corner. If you go to the next slide, I take the two corners in my triangle, which is the stabilization and the redistribution here. And what I have indicated in theory, I said it before, it was the bold plus in the figure. The two tend to go hand in hand. What is presented here is two measures of redistribution and stabilization. What you get, and this is for the public finance report we published last year. On the x-axis, so you have the government redistribution. This is the Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient before and after. So disposable income versus market income. So this is the. And on the y-axis, you have a measure of stabilization, which is following a shock, how much the tax and benefit system smoothen the shock themselves in terms of disposable income. So these are the two measures here. And I think, okay, you can see a positive correlation. However, what is, I think, more interesting than the positive correlation is the fact that there is a bit of a nebulosa around. So it means also that some countries, they manage to strengthen the synergy in a more effective way. So they managed to get more on both, on both sides. So there are those basically, above the regression line. And I think interesting also, not necessarily those who are on the more positive side are those who have very large governments. So you have governments and tax and benefit systems which operate, I think, in an effective way, more effective way. They can achieve both redistribution as well as stabilizing income, while not necessarily implying that you have a very large bloated public sector or a very large share of the state in the economy. So the correlation is positive, although rather weak overall. You go to the next slide. So far I have discussed about the change in the headline balance, so the deficit, the debt thing. But what we know that is particularly important is the composition also. So what we call the quality of public finances. We have done quite a bit of work on that. And one element that comes over and over in the debate is public investment. And allegedly our rules do not safeguard sufficient public investment.
So the bridges fall. I saw the bridges fall in Italy.
You saw the bridges fall in Italy. That is a good example. It's a good example how no. I think it was how jumping to conclusion is a bit is too quick. Okay, here what I will just look at the countries, taking how they behaved in terms of change in public investment over the crisis, and considering as a point of departure the public debt to GDP in 2009. So you look at 2009, the behavior of public investment in the subsequent years differentiated according to the initial level of public debt. If you click again, and another time. Okay, go all. So what? Okay, here there is no a very clear correlation things, but what you can by and large see is the following: countries under the red within the red oval are those who started with high public debt so enter the crisis with high public debt. They cut investment quite substantially. Those countries in the blue oval, so slide to the left here, are countries which, apart from Portugal, which is between the two, also high public debt, they are countries which actually underwent a financial and a banking crisis. So basically you have high public debt in the red, and you have high public debt high private debt under the blue. And you can see in both cases here very large cut in public investment. So the public finance, the quality of public finance actually deteriorated quite substantially. If you then move up, there are those who started with by and large public finance reasonably in order, or as in the case of Belgium, you had high public debt but inherited from the past. That by and large they were not particularly under stress in terms of public finance to start with, and you can see these countries here actually managed to preserve by and large the level of investment. So even loosely, you can have a more rigorous test. Loosely, you can say that if you start and you enter a period of a downturn or crisis, you have your public finances put under pressure. If your initial equilibrium is of not very positive one, then the likelihood that you not only you cut, but you cut the wrong things is actually higher. Now, if you go to the next, then we move to the issue of well, you have told us how good public investment is. Why don't you give a special treatment on this? And this is the request of to move to a so-called golden rule. And in the discussions, and I have to say, here I put in also my experience being in the kitchen, and not only as an observer and as an economist, but looking at how the government's function, the incentives, how they react to certain opportunities, and I think the golden rule as such does not work in practice. Here, I think I've indicated here some reasons why I think it would not be a good idea to shift the Stability Pact into redefining the deficit as the golden rule, so excluding public investment. I think, first of all, public investment, yes, has a probably higher multiplier, but other expenses, but it's not self-financed, so you cannot simply take it out. I think the calls for exemptions of other expenditures is there. Why public investment? Why not defense? Yeah. The latest is border control. Why not education? So there are plenty of things. And actually, I remember Franco Modigliani in a paper that he wrote back in the 1970s, where he analyzing at the time the public expenditure of the Italian government, concluded that expenditure related to growth was about the time 36% of GDP. So you cannot exclude 36% of GDP. So that is I think there is an incentive for creative accounting and reclassification. There is what is not noted often in the discussion is the gross versus net investment also, which is an important differentiation, because what is the logic of excluding investment? The logic is that when you do investment, you profit not only to the current generation, but also to the future ones. So if you finance by issuing debt, future generations will repay gradually those debt that you issued for that. But this is true for net investment, also what adds to the investment. It is not true for amortization, because that is what you have consumed yourself, that you have to finance by taxes. So if you go from gross investment to net investment, then for most of the member states, the net investment is around zero, if not negative. Maybe one can say, okay, we have to do more, but it is not necessarily incompatible with the rules that we have. At the same time, okay, not shifting to the golden rule outright, but one can still consider and try to have an approach in implementing the rules which safeguards investment. So you have the investment clause in the Stability and Growth Pact, so it is under very strict conditions, but this is one of the things. And the proposal on the table of the Council and the Parliament is, as part of the EMU package, is a proposal for investment, a European Investment Stabilization Function, which has the aim precisely in the case of bad shocks to help in order to safeguard the investment, so that one does not let's say, give in to the temptations to cut, good public spending. And why do the governments cut good public spending? I think the reason is political economy, and it is simply that the stronger vested interests are behind other types of spending, not the good ones. Okay, I think that was if you want to check, but I think that was my final slide. So I think I can stop here. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. I just have one question for you about stabilization. You said that, well, if you have good public finances, you're better able to respond to shocks, and you mentioned booms and busts. But actually, the question I would be more interested in is how do we make our economies less prone to booms and busts? So more preventative than curative. And that, to me, remains a puzzle. Of course, you cannot do that just by public finances, because it's just an instrument. But the design of our financial economy is such that booms and busts are built in. And I'd rather build them out.
I think this is it's a very good point. And actually, in the discussions on cyclical stabilization, automatic stabilizers are seen usually as a good thing. why also compared to the discretionary fiscal policy? Because, I mean, they operate on their own. You don't have to make discretionary decisions, so that which often, because of the time lag between the decision and the effects, you end up to be procyclical. So all these stabilizers are seen as a good way, as a good thing, but they have a big but, and the but is that they are activated after the shock has arrived. You know? So unemployment benefits, we want efficient, relatively generous unemployment benefit systems to allow, to cushion there. But you activate the unemployment benefit system once you have lost a job.
Exactly.
So I think the whole making the system more resilient, I think, is essential, and the resilience here actually helps precisely on what you have indicated, which is the preventative part. And I think there are several dimensions of increasing resilience, including, the functioning of product and product markets. I think what has proved during the crisis has been a killer is excessive leverage of the financial sector, and that I think we have to work there in order to reduce precisely the let's say vulnerability to shocks.
Thank you, Gaël. With our transition, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I was not expecting that we would go so far in the basics. So maybe I should spend 5 minutes trying to answer to what you just said, Mr. Buti, because I find it very interesting. In a sense, I roughly agree with what you say, and Musgrave is definitely a good reference. And at the same time, it seems to me that in the triangle that you showed, the Musgrave's triangle, actually all the signs are positive. And that's my viewpoint today, and I would say this is shared by most, not just unorthodox economists, but also orthodox economists. Going back to the issue that there is today a kind of crisis, even within the conventional macroeconomic theory, I just want to confirm this and to mention 3 colleagues of mine. There is Paul Romer, who was the former chief economist of the World Bank, who published a paper in 1916, saying essentially what we have done in macroeconomics since 40 years, we went backwards. Macroeconomic theory today is not a science anymore. It's just a dance around a number of gurus, essentially coming from the eastern coast of the US. But this is the chief economist of the World Bank saying this. Then you have a paper at the same time published by Olivier Blanchard, French chief economist of the IMF, saying the DSG models, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, which are the standard models used by most international institutions, including the IMF, the ECB, the Banque de France, etc. They are basically flawed. I'm quoting Olivier Blanchard. And there is also a paper published exactly at the same time, and probably they coordinated, by Narayana Kocherlakota, who was the former governor of the Central Bank of Minneapolis, saying we won't fix the problems of macroeconomic theory today just by changing some epsilon in our models. We need a paradigm shift. So there is indeed today a big crisis in macroeconomic theory, and I think that's why it's very helpful that we have this kind of discussion as we do today. Now, going back to this triangle of Musgrave, I would mention the fact that, as you actually said a couple of minutes later, private debts play a pivotal role in the story. So let me just explain to you, this takes 10 seconds. Suppose that here, this room is the entire country that we are studying, and that everybody has a lot of debt, private debt. And you know that in the Eurozone today, private debts are much higher than public debts. So the average public debt is 100% of the GDP in the Eurozone. Private debt is 130. So it's much more. Now suppose that everybody has a lot of debt. And that, of course, since you are a private corporation, you want to be able to invest for tomorrow, because this is the source of your profit tomorrow. In order to be able to invest, you need to borrow money from the bank, and the bank is telling you, well, you have too much debt. Just begin first by paying back your debt, and after that we will lend you some money. So what you have to do is to try to deleverage. But the unique way to do this for that purpose is to sell some assets. So you are forced to sell assets. So suppose each of us is selling assets, then what's happening is that the price, the general level of prices on the market for assets will decline, because everybody is selling. So the supply is just increasing and there is no demand for that. so the prices will decrease. Now suppose that Philippe, who is very clever, who is one of the members of this economy, has 100 as debt, 100 something, whatever the unit, 100. And suppose that by selling some assets, he succeeds in reducing his nominal debt from 100 to 90. That's good. So he reduces by 10%. But at the same time, suppose that the general level of prices declined by minus 20%. Then the real debt of Philippe increased. And that's the big problem of a situation, of a macroeconomic situation known since the 30s and since the beautiful work by Irving Fisher, who was not a crazy leftist. It's a fact that if you are in an economy where everybody has a lot of debt, a lot of private debt, everybody needs to deleverage. If everybody is doing this at the same time, then it's impossible. Then you will have more and more real debt. And that's exactly what's happening today in Greece. That's why the treatment that we inflicted to Greece was essentially meaningless, in the sense that we are just increasing actually the ratio between public debt and GDP, because all we are doing is reducing GDP much faster than the public debt in Greece. So, mutatis mutandis, it's the same story. In an economy with a lot of private debt, there is a unique actor who can counteract this deflationary impact of private debt, which is the state. The state. The state.
Government.
The government. So my viewpoint is that in a situation like the one we have in the Eurozone today, what we should do is help the state still finance investment, give room for the private sector to deleverage, and after that, once the private finance will be much healthier as it is today, then the state will have to deleverage later on. So it's not a way to say you can spend any money you want as a state, you are sovereign and that's it, that's the end of the story. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we have made a mistake in the timing. We have put the deleverage of the public sector before that of the private sector, whereas we should do exactly the opposite. Why? Because the big difference is that the unique institution which can survive by still having a lot of debt is the state, whereas in the private sector, if you have too much debt, you just die. So, okay, so that's why my answer, and the second part of my answer is that the classical dichotomy between equity and efficiency, it seems to me today is not relevant anymore, in the sense that, first of all, we know that the trickle-down effect theory is wrong. So it's not true that if you make the rich richer, this will benefit everybody. Even the IMF published some reports saying that we have now empirical evidence that this is not true. First and second, now going back to the ecological issue, this classical dichotomy between, the size of the cake on the one hand and how you distribute the cake on the other hand, so efficiency on the one hand, equity on the other hand, this classical debate completely neglects the way you cook the cake and the way you divide it. So if by cooking the cake you destroy the planet, then the issue is not anymore to increase the growth, the size of the cake. And if by distributing the cake in such or such way you still destroy the planet, then again it's not purely a question of efficiency. And you know that today, those who are polluting are the rich, essentially. So to give you some figures, at the world level, the 10% of the richest people in the world are responsible for 45% of the emissions of greenhouse gas.
How many?
45. So the top decile, the top 10%, are responsible for 45% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And the 50%, the 50 bottom percent, the poorest in the world, so 3.5 billion people, are responsible for 13% of greenhouse gas emissions. So pollution and CO2 emissions is essentially a problem of being too rich. So the way you distribute wealth matters also for ecological reasons. So, and that's why it seems to me we cannot just repeat this classical debate, even though even in France you find a number of people, politicians, saying that, first, the trickle-down effect is true, which is definitely a mistake, and second, they entirely neglect the way we cook the cake, and that's why it seems to me we have to reconsider the entire story. Myself, I have a number of works showing that if you have too much inequality, then this is detrimental even for growth. So even if you believe that growth is a good thing, So even if you neglect the ecological impact of growth, having too much inequality is detrimental to growth, which is exactly the opposite of what we have taught, including myself, during years in university.
If we want degrowth, we should have maximum inequality, actually.
Exactly. And that's exactly the kind of conclusion we'll reach. Okay. So now let me go to my slides. What I wanted to argue in these slides is that we definitely need public investment for the ecological shift. So there is a report by the high-level expert group on sustainable finance, which published a report in July 2017, last year, estimating that currently the EU is not on track to deliver the 11.2 trillion euros required to meet its 2030 energy policy targets. So according to this report, there is an investment gap at around 175 billion per annum, which leads to a total of 1.77 trillion for the next decade. So that's a lot of money. At the world level, the situation is even worse. The estimation is that the investment needed in order to remain below the 2-degree threshold at the end of this century is between 50 and 90 trillion dollars for the next 15 years. So that's a lot of money. That's approximately of the same order of magnitude as the world GDP. And the big question that we all face, including at the French Development Agency, the World Bank, in the IMF, etc., in the Green Fund, is who is going to pay this? And the answer is, of course, the private sector will play its role, and we are urgently calling the private sector to enter into this big struggle. But the private sector has a lot of debt. And then we go back to my first point, which is when the private sector has too much debt, and again, the private sector is much more indebted today than the public sector, with one exception, of course, which is Japan. Then the public sector has to enter into the arena. Next slide. For what do we need this money? Very briefly, I don't go into the details. You know that we need an industrial reconversion in order to have green industry in Europe. You know that we need to declare that a number of fossil fuel are stranded assets, of course coal, but maybe also gas. Probably you know the debate on gas today. If you want, I can go back to the details. There are a number of people saying that gas itself, even methane, should be a stranded asset. If it is, then we need a lot of money to convert our energy system in order to be independent from these stranded assets. We need money for the energy shift towards renewable energies. We need money for the thermal renovation of buildings. This concerns all the countries in Europe. We haven't done it, especially the public buildings, but also the private buildings, because we know that the households will not pay the bill for that. We need money for research and development in looking for substitutes for minerals. Probably you're not aware of that, but our industrial revolution is also very highly dependent on minerals, let's say on copper. And my own research with geophysicists have shown that we are going to reach some peak of extraction of a number of these minerals in the coming decades, including copper and bauxite. So it's urgent today to free ourselves from this dependency. China is doing its best for that. I don't know, I'm not sure. I know that we're not doing the best we could do in Europe for that purpose. We need money for green mobility. That's the issue of electric cars, hydrogen cars, train, etc. We need money to use hydrogen to store energy, etc., etc., etc. And of course, we need money to make all this acceptable. So for that purpose, we need some compensation to make it socially acceptable, because as you know, there will be a number of poor households which will be captured, trapped in precarity. Let's say if you put a carbon tax of $100 per ton, as we should do actually, even though we are not doing it, then there will be a number of poor households throughout Europe who will be penalized by this, and they need to be compensated. Next slide. This is a positive aspect. I mean, it will provide a number of benefits to the European economy. It will, of course, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It will limit our energy dependency, which is a crucial aspect for sovereignty of Europe, and it will also improve our balance of trade. If I just take the French example, the French deficit of the balance of trade is around 70 billion euros per year, and that's approximately the bill of the oil that we import in France. So if we were to reduce this to zero, we essentially would have a balanced balance of trade, you see. Let me give you an example. I'm very impressed by this example, which is Indonesia. Indonesia has decided recently to cut all its subsidies for fossil fuels and to use the saved money to finance a universal health security system for the entire population. Question, why don't we do it in Europe? Next slide. What are the levels of financing? So here I give a list of a number of ideas that are today discussed in many circles in Europe. Of course, there is the carbon pricing. I was last year a member of the Stern-Stiglitz Commission, which published its report last year. The Stern-Stiglitz Commission says that we should have a corridor of carbon prices between $40 and $80 per ton in 2020 and between $50 and $100 per ton in 2030. We are far from it. You know that the carbon price in the European ETS market is around 20 today, so we need to increase it, definitely. You know also that the French President Macron took a strong position on this issue in a number of speeches, and this has originated a debate with Germany. So that's one point. The second is using the revenues of the tax on financial transactions. This is one solution put forward by, let's say, the Canfin-Grandjean report by 2015. There is the issue of the public guarantee, and I'm very in favor of it. We have used the public guarantee in order to save our banks in 2008. I don't know whether you know this trick. In late 2008, in December, in France, the four systemic banks, BNP Paribas, Société Générale, Natixis, and Crédit Agricole, were essentially bankrupt. So what we have done is that within 3 days, we have constructed a society, a private society, with the capital of the banks, with the public guarantee given by the government. This society has borrowed 70 billion euros within 1 year in order to lend this money to the banks, to the French banks, so that they didn't have to go to the interbank market to borrow money. Why and how did we succeed in doing this? Thanks to the public guarantee. Because the investors knew that they would not bear any risk lending money to this society, even though it was a private society. And since it was a private society, it did not impact the public debt of France. So the question I'm asking since 2009 is that the trick we used to save the banks, why don't we use them to save the planet? There is also of course, the highly debated question of green bonus and malus. So you know that every time a private bank is providing a credit, it has to fulfill a number of capital requirements. So the idea is that we could soften these capital requirements each time the credit is green, and we could harsher this capital requirement each time the credit is brown. So this is the green supporting factor idea. Of course, the banks are quite enthusiastic with the green bonus, and they are against the green malus. But what I reply to this is that, of course, we don't not just need the banks to finance green investment. We need also to stop all the brown investments. Otherwise, it's useless. So for that purpose, we definitely need brown malus, it seems to me. And this belongs to the big question of the rewriting of the prudential framework of Basel III. There is also the idea put forward by Mario Monti in his report last year, which consists in increasing the tax on profits and using these revenues in order to finance green investments in Europe. And there is also the highly debated issue of the green quantitative easing by the ECB. I will go back to this in a second. Next slide. How could we use this last idea of implementing a quantitative easing of the ECB without violating the European treaties, but now this time for green investments? One idea would be to call for the European Investment Bank, whose expertise on green assets is highly acknowledged. The European investment banks could emit a number of green bonds, which would be automatically repurchased by the ECB. This is the place where the ECB would create money. It's a quantitative easing policy. And using this money, the European investment banks could finance at the European level a number of projects and could increase, for instance, the size of the Juncker plan, which is much too small in comparison with what we need to do in Europe today.
Targeted.
And not targeted, yes, you're right. So another possibility would be, of course, to accept the green investment from the requirements of the European constraints, let's say the 3% deficit. This is also discussed, as you know, today. But you see the first proposal I make, which is using the European Investment Bank and the ECB, does not require you to do any trick, any accounting trick, in order to save the situation in Europe. We can do it tomorrow morning. And, for instance, someone like Philippe Maystadt, who was one of the leaders of the European Investment Bank before he retired, is highly in favor of this kind of policy, which is entirely conventional, orthodox. And I will stop here by saying just one last remark. All our conventions in economics and in finance are just conventions, which means they are very important. But, we will never be able to violate the first two laws of thermodynamics. They will win at the end of the day. So the question is, do we wait that they will against us, or do we change our conventions before they beat us? Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. So first of all, I must say I'm a political scientist at IDDRI, and I work usually on topics related to governance of sustainable development, and focus since 2 years a lot on the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, to see how this agenda is used by different actors, what it allows to change or not. So I'm not a public finance expert as such, at least not yet, because my generation is likely to change careers several times, so maybe one day. But I'm very happy to participate in this debate, and I was asked to speak about a study that we did at IDDRI that is about integrating SDGs into national budgetary processes, which is quite an explorative study where we just really looked at what countries do so far, and we haven't done the link yet in the study to the EU level, but that's also why I'm very happy to be here today to explore this together with you. So to give some context, the year 2015 is often cited as a very strong year for multilateral engagement for sustainable development with the Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement. So in 2015, countries, they kind of defined the ends, they defined what the world should look like in the decades to come, in 2030, for example, for the Agenda 2030. And now we're in the implementation phase, which is even more complicated than the negotiation phase already was. And so we see national budgets as one powerful, potentially powerful strategic means of implementation. So next slide. For those who are not familiar with the SDGs, very briefly, there are 17 of them. 169 targets and about 200 indicators. And you can organize these targets also between end state goals and means. So on one side, what goals that define what the world should look like in 2030, and on the other side, what could be means and strategies to achieve this end state goals. So in our study, as I said, we looked at the budget as a potential means of implementation. Next slide. And that is because we heard an increasing number of countries announcing measures to align their budgets with the SDGs. So we wanted to know what that aligning the budgets with the SDGs actually means. For example, between 2016 and 2017, there were around 23 countries that announced such an alignment. So we thought, well, that sounds interesting and actually quite intuitive that the budget as a means of implementation should be in line with these international commitments that countries signed. But then what does it mean concretely? What does it look like? So we looked at 9 case studies, very different countries around the world, from Finland to Mexico to Afghanistan. And this research is mostly based on interviews and desk research. So what we saw that is countries use the SDGs in very different ways. And first of all, some questions that came around in the interviews and throughout our research and that are, I think, particularly relevant for our discussion today is one is that some countries asked in the interview, well, in the context of fiscal consolidation, how do we achieve at the same time, how do we reduce our fiscal deficit while achieving these very ambitious environmental and social objectives? And another question that came around very often is, well, the SDG agenda is so broad and overarching, while budgets are basically about making tough choices. So how do we bring these two together? Yes, and so that is something that we realized in several countries, is that they said, well, the SDGs agenda as such is too broad to be operationalized directly and be integrated or linked to the budgetary process. So a key step for many countries was to translate this agenda into a strategic understanding of the situation of the country and use it actually as an opportunity to create a common narrative and vision in the country around what could be the priority development goals in a given country. And these priorities that are then chosen are not just random, but they are usually reflecting the three dimensions of sustainable development. So that would be important if you really want to say that there's still a link to the SDGs. Just to make up an example, what could be one country could, for example, say on the basis of an analysis of the state of the country, the priorities could be, for example, okay, we have to protect biodiversity, climate action, we fight inequalities and create decent work. So that is our package of national strategic medium-term priorities. That is just an example. And one country that engaged in such a process is Slovenia, for example. And they started with defining strategic orientations and national development goals along the three dimensions of sustainable development, integrated these goals into a Slovenia 2030 strategy, and then as a next step, adopted performance evaluation indicators for the national budget based on these strategies, these priorities and this strategy. Another question that we ourselves asked us through the research is, okay, why could it be interesting to make this link between the sustainable development goals and the budget? What could it be useful for? And so we thought, okay, maybe it is useful to guide choices about where to spend or how to spend. Maybe it could even be useful to guide choices about, okay, where to cut expenditures, where do we have to reduce, and also think about how and where to raise revenue. So now we can look a bit about what we really found in the countries. So first of all, next slide, do we see countries use the SDGs as a tool to identify priority areas for spending? In many countries, we're not there yet. The SDGs or these discussions around that and the national translation processes do not really have an impact on the allocation of resources yet in most of the countries, even though there are some exceptions. And one example that maybe comes the closest is Slovakia. Again, they started by translating the SDGs into strategic national goals, clustered around the 17 SDGs. And they also adopted a 2030 strategy, and this strategy will be fed into a national investment plan. Next slide. Do we see countries use the SDGs as a tool to question their taxation systems and to identify innovative sources of revenue? Yes, we observed this in some countries. One is Colombia. So, I mean, taxes can have basically two functions. They are there to raise more income, but they can also be used to create behavioral change, and sometimes they do both. So in Colombia, what we saw at their presentation at the high-level political forum this year is that they really started a reflection process on their taxation systems and how this can be put in service for achieving their sustainable development goals. One example that they gave was the introduction of a tax on plastic bags that was raised revenue quite quickly and also created behavioral change. And another country where we saw such a reflection process is in Finland, because they will start to include an assessment of the consistency of their taxes and subsidies, but that's another issue, with their national sustainable development priorities in the budget document. Next slide. So do we see countries use the SDGs as a tool to identify priority areas for reducing expenditures? So far, this is not something that we have observed in the countries, but it could maybe be interesting and imagined. For example, in the context of a budget reduction process, one could ask the question, okay, how do we ensure that the priorities for reducing expenses are discussed with respect to sustainable development goals, and especially the national goals that the countries have set for themselves. So especially, basically as a guiding tool to what to cut first and last. Could we use them as a tool to evaluate and discuss the impact of such a reduction in spending, and finally use it as a tool to weigh the reduction in spending in different areas? So for this, we have more questions than answers, but as using it in that context, but it could be imagined. Then, this slide. What other ways that we have observed how countries use the SDGs in their budgetary processes are some countries, and those are mostly the developed countries, they make reference to different sustainable development goals in their main budget document. They say so that that helps to improve the narrative of a budget. Some countries ask, for example, their ministries to include reporting elements on the progress towards the SDGs in the main budget document, for example, in Norway or Finland. Other countries, and those are mostly developing and emerging countries, they started to map their budget against the SDGs. Here is an example for Nepal and the Assam, which is a state in India. So this mapping just gives kind of an overview of a given budget and how it links to different SDG goals, which can be useful information to see, okay, which are the SDGs that are well covered or not well covered by a budget. But then that's a lot of information and can be interesting if it is used, for example, by parliamentarians, ministries, NGOs, to be fed back into the next decision-making cycle. Otherwise, it's a lot of work, very technical, and if it's not used, maybe a lot of work and not very effective. Next slide. So one question that also came up is how do we link what we could call SDG budgeting with other existing and converging initiatives. SDGs are not the first attempt to make sustainable development count in a budgetary process. And to give the example of France is, and that's also the topic, I think, of the conference these days, is in France there has been adopted a law in 2015 on beyond GDP alternative new wealth indicators, and the idea was that a report should be handed over to the Parliament every year that gives an overview of these indicators, and it should be given to the Parliament at the same moment then at the moment of the budgetary debate, with the idea that this report could feed into the debate and inform strategic orientations. So this report on this new wealth indicators still exists, but the initial idea that it feeds into the budgetary debate didn't really work out so far. Then France also last December announced at the One Planet Summit that they support the Paris Collaborative on Green Budgeting, which is an initiative launched by the OECD. And its objective is to align national expenditure and revenue processes with climate and environmental goals especially. And now there are the SDGs, and the potential link between SDGs and the budget was already mentioned in an interministerial document in February in France, and now there is a roadmap elaboration process for the SDGs in France, and the integration into the budget is also one of the topics that will be discussed. And some already say that maybe instead of reinventing the wheel, maybe we could use the SDGs as an opportunity to relaunch the initial idea of this law on new wealth indicators to be a strategic instrument to inform the budgetary debate. So some conclusions. If you want to integrate the SDGs into a budgetary process, this needs, first of all, a common narrative about what sustainable development means for the given country. So as a first step, it needs a discussion and a debate on national sustainable development priorities, and that's actually a great opportunity. Then, once this is done, the SDGs can be a tool to evaluate the impact of budgetary and fiscal policies and guide choices, for example, even about reducing expenditures. They are an opportunity to identify and prioritize investment needs, as we have seen in Slovakia, and they are an opportunity to assess the consistency of taxes and subsidies with the national sustainable development priorities. One must say that so far these measures are still remain in its infancy. And in some countries, we see the risk that the debate around these measures is purely a technical debate and lacks a bit the political side. And I think this was sometimes the same problem with the new wealth indicator debate. So we see a risk here. And then last, the SDGs are not the first attempt to link sustainable development to budgetary and fiscal policies. So the question is, how can different initiatives join forces, and what do we need really to move forward in this? Last slide. Yes, so as I said, we haven't explored a lot the link to the EU level in our study so far, but so on that level I have more questions than answers, but I'm happy to discuss them here today. And some questions would be, what can the EU learn from these emerging practices and processes, especially from its member states? And some are quite advanced. For example, Finland and Slovakia, others are starting just to think about it, like, for example, Spain and France. How can the EU support member states in aligning their budgets with their strategic medium and long-term sustainable development and climate objectives? How can the SDGs become useful in negotiating priorities in the context of budgetary constraints? And yeah, maybe regarding the Stability and Growth Pact, there might be a need for guidance on strengthening the link between fiscal responsibility and national medium-term sustainable development pathways. Thank you very much. That's from my side.
Thank you. Now, we're doing well time-wise. Just one question to you. Would you agree with the statement that would say, okay, let's make a number of these SDGs, let's translate them into binding targets that would be declined country by country, and then to you, Marco, let's monitor, when we do the budget monitoring exercise through the semester process, can we use the semester as a way to steer and encourage governments to do the right thing? If we have, of course, these binding targets, we have them for CO2, for renewables, but there's many other SDGs where we have no binding targets. So first to you, Elisabeth, and then back to you, Marco, and then to the floor.
Yes, actually, that's one of the options that we were thinking about that we think would make sense. And I think that these processes that are taking place at the country level on defining these targets and making them binding maybe at the national level, the same process could be interesting at the European level to have a EU 2030 strategy.
I've heard you saying that we have already overburdened the semester with too many things, but actually...
I have written it here.
Voilà. So I could predict your answer.
That was my okay. I think there is in the broad review of economic governance. I think there has been calls, for instance, by Agnès Benassi and others, to let's say apportion goals and instruments in a match it in a more efficient way. So basically, what do we have? We have the within. In our governance system, we have the fiscal issues. Yeah. We have the macroeconomic imbalances. These are you mentioned the six-pack. That's one of the innovation during the crisis. And then you have what has been so far the EU 2020 targets. Now, I think we need to review the EU 2020 and EU 2030, and I think there we can certainly incorporate the Sustainable Development Goals, I think, in a specified way. Now, I think the time dimension of this is different, and I think we need to find proper monitoring system. The overburdening is one of the concerns that I have. I mean, if we put too much all in one process, then I think we risk to blur things. So, but I agree that we will need to find collectively an efficient monitoring system which would allow to check whether countries do what they have agreed.
Yeah, I would expect at least the country-specific recommendations to steer policy making in that direction. Gaël, you had a question to Elisabeth?
Yeah, I had a small question which is a little bit provocative, but actually, of course, at the French Development Agency, we feel directly concerned by these SDGs. Actually, it's our job to implement them in certain countries. Reflecting on this with a number of other colleagues from the World Bank, the BNDES in Brazil, the SDA in South Africa, etc., we have a big question within the international community, which is, are we sure that all these goals are consistent? Are we sure that by promoting, let's say, SDG number 8, we are not making it possible to implement SDG number 13? And actually, it seems to me the international community at the United Nations by 2015, September, when we agreed on these 17 SDGs, what we did is to say, well, let's make sure that we don't forget anything. So we put everything we have in mind that we could wish to have, including the reduction of inequalities, and that's good. I'm not saying, it's not a critique in itself. It's much better to have the SDGs than the Millennium Goals we had earlier. But at the same time, we did not reflect on the possible inconsistencies between these 17 SDGs, and if there are, and there are a number of reasons to believe that there are some inconsistencies. Well, you have on one hand enhancing growth, on the other hand protecting, a number of natural ecosystems. Are we sure that we can do both at the same time? It's not clear. Then if they are not consistent, then the big question is how do you choose? Which priority do you give to each of these SDGs? And this becomes a huge and important political question, it seems to me.
Yes, I agree, and that I think at the international level, the Sustainable Development Goals, they are like, as a package, they are a compromise. So there are inconsistencies, and that is why I think the step downwards to the national level is so important, and that then the debate on working out these inconsistencies, they can be a great opportunity to launch this very inclusive and democratic debate on this. But it's also very complicated, and we observe this a lot, and it's quite frustrating because it's such a compromise, there are lots of different interpretations, and it takes a lot of time to discuss this out. But one example that I found encouraging is that someone from an NGO in Spain told me that with the former government there was not much going on the SDGs, and then the NGOs, they were trying to fill this void and working on this, and they created a big alliance among very different NGOs, and now also trade unions are joining. So there are around 50 organizations, and they spent like 1 year debating what do these Sustainable Development Goals mean for Spain. It was like feminist organizations, development NGOs, and so on, and they said it was not easy, and it really took 1 year, but then they came out with 10 priorities for Spain and an interpretation of what these SDGs mean for Spain, and these 10 points, they were very powerful because there were 50 organizations backing them, and this, when the new government came in, they clearly had a strong voice and were heard with this strong advocacy campaign. Yeah.
Thank you. Over to you. We have a little less than 1 hour, which is not bad. So, my lady in pink.
Can you hear me? Yes. I have a question for Mr. Buti. My name is Katrin Latsch. I'm from Germany and the speaker of a network for monetary diversity. I am interested in the question, well, we have seen in the last decades growth in the financial sector much, much stronger than in the so-called real economy. At the moment, the financial sector is at least 10 times bigger than the real economy. And I would like to know, how do we shrink this financial sector, which is so much bigger than that what we are wishing for, which is a real economy that does support sustainable development. And my second question is, what do you think about credit guidance? Credit guidance, yes. Well, credit guidance from my point of view is, for example, or could be a European Union which supports the SDGs with certain goals and does say obligatory to private banks that they have to give credit to enterprises which would like to work in that field.
This is more than green or brown factors in risk weights. It's more binding. I'll take questions in threes. So, yes?
Hello, I'm Ludovic Becquet from the University of Namur. We heard today about sustainability, one's fiscal sustainability and also environmental sustainability. And it seems to me like there is somehow of a paradox or a trade-off between the two, in a sense that if you want to, like, growth makes it much easier to repay the debt. I mean, most of the countries just grow out of their debt. But then at the same time, it becomes more and more clear that growth really makes it much harder to reach environmental sustainability. And even if you don't go to such such big pictures, if we also talked about environmental taxation, and in a sense, a good environmental tax does not bring any money if it reaches its environmental goal, because then it means there is no pollution. And if it brings money, it means there is still pollution. So we really have to choose between one goal or another. So I wanted to see your view on this trade-off, or what seems to me at least as a trade-off between fiscal sustainability and environmental sustainability.
Thank you. I'm Edwin Zakai from University of Brussels. I have a question about the European Finance Pact for Climate, which was launched last year by two French people, Jouzel and Larouturou, and was signed by many people, including Maestad, that was cited. What do you think of its chance to advance or to succeed? Is it still something strong, or what do you think of it? Thank you.
It's a proposal that I support, and that is quite close to one of the proposals that Gaël showed on his slide.
Yes, but the idea is also to avoid a financial crisis in investing in what Gaël has showed. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, I'll take the speakers in the same order. So, Marco.
Not too many questions, so maybe I make a little comment on Gaël, so that they give the chance to. And maybe to you also, Philippe. Now, I think on the financial sector overgrowth, I think, first of all, it is absolutely true that in the period running to the crisis, there was financial sectors which expanded worldwide very much, and one can certainly ask a legitimate question on the, let's say, added social value of many of these activities, leaving aside the fact that by themselves they create inner vulnerabilities, which then actually put the real wealth and real welfare into question. I think what we have done and have followed since the beginning of the crisis, especially at the international level in the G20, we have tried to insert and adopt regulations which would allow to, let's say, tame the financial sector, reduce the risks on that front. I think the work is not completed yet. I think we are still in the implementation phase. We had to struggle actually in the international level because there is quite a lot of pushback, especially now with the Trump administration, which want to roll back a number of regulations which were. But I think we have to stand very firm on that front. At the same time, we have to avoid to throw the baby, the bathwater. Yes, the baby no. And if you think about a number of goals that we are talking here, you have been talking in this conference, also in other sessions, I think the financial sector can actually help to achieve those. So we are talking about green bonds, sustainable finance. I think we have to channel the financial, let's say, financial sectors and into the direction that you want to deliver those goals. But they cannot be done only via public sector commitments. You have to mobilize the private capital and that private finance. I think the right instruments there, I think, can help on that front. I mean, we are, let's say, for the means that we have, hopefully after discussion with the Council and counting very much on the help of the Parliament, we can have an MFF post-2020 which is very forward-looking. I mean, the Commission has put forward there a number of proposals, both on the financing or resources side, related to plastic, for instance, and also on the spending side. I mean, one proposal that comes directly from my own DG is on the InvestEU, where we have, for instance, an infrastructure window, sustainable infrastructure window, which actually aims at delivering some of the objectives that we talked about, consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals. And how do we do that? We do that by combining a number of financial instruments in a more effective, more cohesive way. So my answer is rather nuanced. Yes, on what needs to be done in order to avoid that the financial sector poses a threat to stability. At the same time, I think develop what means in order to have private capital and private finance contributing to those objectives. On the semester, just en passant, you mentioned, Philippe, I mean, I was checking actually not in a absolutely explicit way, but we have 13, 14 countries which receive country-specific recommendation shifting taxation away from labor towards properties and towards environmental, towards consumption. So I think it is. I mean, there is already something there that goes in that direction. On the trade-offs, that's. I mean, economics and economic policy. We have. It's a question of trade-offs. We can try to have and to valorize areas where we have synergies, but trade-offs are more incumbent and more difficult than synergies there. And I agree. I think your point is well taken. I'm going to say something that is not going to be very popular probably here for the audience, at least a part of the audience, and it is that stagnation does not help to lessen the trade-offs. Neither on the environmental side, also because you keep alive industries which are in a very defensive way, which are actually polluting much more than others. It does not help in terms of social goals and equity. And I have to say, in saying this, I have in mind the country I know best, where stagnation over very, very low growth over 25 years or so has actually not helped at all in lessening the trade-offs you discussed. So yes, a model of growth and we are working, for instance, on, there is a lot of potential on the circular economy. I mean, we have come forward with proposal of rather soft because the tools that we have are not very strong. I think so. A different model of growth, but I have to say I'm not a partisan of the happy décroissance. Final point was on listening to Gaël in the first intervention. I want to react on that. When you look at, in the case of crisis and recession, the respective role of the private sector and the public sector, actually, one of my initial slides when I showed the behavior of GDP when you start with low debt, high debt, etc. A point implicit there was this shift between private and public is eased when you start with conditions which are of sound public finances in the first place, because what we have seen during the crisis is that at a certain point several countries came very close to that or actually hit the wall, is when you lose market access, you cannot do that shift anymore. So I think this is a message that, let's say, in reasonably good times, you should recreate conditional sustainability, and that helps also for that shift that you may have to accept or favor in bad times.
Thank you, Gaël.
Thank you. On the first question, which is how do you reduce the size of the financial sphere? So a number of remarks very rapidly. Of course, there are a number of reforms you can think of, and I belong to those who have published a number of proposals in this direction. So, for instance, you could cut the banks, that is, really cut the investment market banks on the one hand, and retail and deposit banks on the other hand. As you know, the French law and the German law don't cut the banks, even though they claim to do it. Michel Barnier's proposal to do it at the European level was not accepted by the European Parliament, was rejected. I do believe that's a mistake. This is one thing we could do very easily, even though I know that private banks are strongly against this proposal, but I do believe that this would be a major step. You would have a number of other proposals very quickly. You could increase the equity ratio, that is the ratio between equity and the size of the balance sheet of the banks. Nowadays, if you neglect all the tricks used with the risk weights, which are a way to eliminate the problem, then the equity ratio of most systemic banks in Europe are below 3%. In 2008, a number of European banks lost something like minus 11% of their assets, which means if we have a crash of the same magnitude as in 2008 tomorrow morning, most systemic banks in Europe will be bankrupt. So they are undercapitalized, and the IMF also acknowledged this. So one thing would be to, as a prudential requirement, to increase the equity ratio. Another idea would be to increase the reserve requirement. That is, each time a bank emits a credit, it has to have, in the Eurozone today, 1% of this credit as central bank money in its balance sheet. A number of banks, of course, argue that we should reduce this ratio to 0 and to cut any link between the private banks and the European Central Bank. I do believe this would be a huge mistake. And you have a number of people who are certainly not leftist, like Adair Turner in the UK, who are saying we should increase the reserve requirements so that we should go a little bit further in the direction of the credit guidance that you are mentioning, like the Crédit Dirigé in France. So, of course, we should just forbid the high-frequency trading, I believe, which brings nothing useful, etc., etc. There is the big issue of the shadow banking, etc. I would say, there is a specificity today in the current financial bubble, which is the fact that between 2010 and today, it has been in Europe, essentially fueled in Europe and the US, essentially fueled by the quantitative easing of central banks. There is a big change at the macroeconomic level occurring today. Before 2008, the financial sphere in Western countries was fueled by the big commercial surplus of China. China was accumulating each year between $2,000 and $3,000 billion as commercial surplus, and was reinvesting this huge amount of money in the Western financial sphere, partly by buying US public debt. Since 2009, China has changed entirely its big commercial strategy. As you know, the commercial balance of China is almost balanced today, so there is no surplus anymore in China. So there is no country which is reinvesting from the real economy new money in the financial sphere in Western countries, so that this bubble today is purely, essentially, roughly speaking, fueled by the quantitative easing. So the very day we stop this quantitative easing, there is nothing more to add more money in the machine. This is why we have so much debates on whether the Fed will increase or not its interest rate, because this might be the beginning of the end of this big era of quantitative easing processes. And of course, I don't know the end of the story, but sooner or later we will stop these quantitative easing policies, and then I'm wondering what will still feed the financial sphere. One symptom of that is that if you look at the number of equities which are traded on markets, this number is reducing every year. So every year there are less and less firms which go on the market and provide equities. So the number of equities is reducing by minus 2% every year. If we keep going in this direction, in 35 years, we can close at the world level the equity market. There won't be any equity at all to be sold. And this is a symptom of the fact that many corporates have understood they can't go on the market to take money. That's not the place where they can do it. But the cost to be paid for that is too high. Okay? On the credit guidance, it actually in France it was called the Crédit Dirigé until the beginning of the 70s. I do believe this is also what we should do. In a sense, some of the proposals I made go in this direction, but we should keep in mind that we have done it at a period where the position of the central bank was entirely different. So there was no point in having an independent central bank at this time. For instance, in France, the Banque de France was lending at a zero interest rate directly to the Treasury, the French Treasury. This was called the Circuit du Trésor de Bloch-Léné at this time. Today, as you know, it's impossible in the Eurozone because the European Central Bank is not allowed to lend money directly on the primary market to the states. First, and second, the dogma of the independence of the European Central Bank leads to the situation where essentially, roughly speaking, and maybe Philippe will disagree on this, there is no political body in front of which the European Central Bank is responsible for its policy. Of course, you could say this should be the European Parliament, but I'm skeptical about whether really the European Parliament has its word to say about the policy of the European Central Bank. For instance, the decision taken by the ECB during the Greek crisis to cut the flow of euro to the Greek banks 1 week before the referendum. I don't know whether the European Parliament has been asked whether it would agree on this policy. So you see, credit guidance belongs to an era which is far from us today. This is not to say I'm not in favor of it, but there are a number of steps that we have to make before implementing it. On the trade-off, very quickly, between fiscal and environmental sustainability, my opinion is that actually they go in the same direction. If we want to have fiscal sustainability, we need environmental sustainability. Of course, stagnation, and I agree with Mr. Buti, stagnation in itself is not a good goal. If it's stagnation, that is stagnation, let's say, by disaster or by constraint. But if we organize a certain kind of stagnation by design in order to grow in some number of directions that we wish to have, then it's another story. Then the question is not between degrowth on the one hand and growth on the other hand, is what do we want to grow today, and what do we want to degrow? We certainly want to decrease the quantity of greenhouse gas we emit. GDP, as you know, is a bad indicator of anything. And if you have an accident on the street, this increases GDP. Are we sure this is what we want to have? And as you know, GDP is so strongly correlated to greenhouse gas emissions today that the best indicator for CO2 emissions is GDP. So we definitely need to rethink about it. And as you know, and as you said, there are a number of alternate indicators which perform much better than GDP. This is not a plea in favor of degrowth. This is a plea in favor of a political discernment between the kinds of dimension we want to reduce and the others we want to let increase. And lastly, on the Larouturou-Jouzel proposal, which is essentially to say, it's a little bit different from what I said. The Larouturou-Jouzel proposal is to say, well, the ECB should, let's say, roughly speaking, give a check of this amount of X thousand billion euros to finance green investments, which is something I also advocated a number of years ago. And actually, Pierre and Jean Jouzel are very good friends of mine. You know, the issue, of course, is the immediate reply you have is that this will foster inflation. Of course, this objection is not true. It's not true that increasing the quantity of money per se increases inflation. It depends upon the way you use this money. But it seems to me the proposal I made in my slides are much easier to implement because they are entirely natural. You use the European Investment Bank, whose mission is to invest. Who can do it? Which has a lot of expertise on green investments. And you just ask the ECB to repurchase the green bonds of the European investment banks. Actually, in 2014, if you remember, the ECB said we are ready to rebuy any asset-backed securities emitted by any private bank, which was a way to say to the European banks, we are ready. Do any securitization you want. We will withdraw the risk from your balance sheet by rebuying the asset-backed security that you will emit in front of your new credit. And at this time, I went to Frankfurt am Main to see my old friend, who is Benoît Cœuré, who is a classmate of mine, sitting on the board of the ECB, and I told him, that's exactly the right thing to do, but for green investments only. You should say, we are ready to repurchase any asset-backed security for green investments. And then he told me, well, green is just a sectoral issue. I'm a central banker, so I deal with everything. So I cannot, give any privilege to the green sector against any other sector. And I understand this viewpoint, even though I believe, with all friendship due to Benoît, that it's wrong. My objection is to say carbon belongs to everything. We have carbon in every sector, so we need to have decarbonization everywhere. So green is not a sectoral issue; it's a transversal, universal problem. So it belongs definitely to the mission of the central banker to deal with it. At least that's my opinion. And then essentially what I'm saying about the link between the ECB and the European Investment Bank on the one hand, and having a kind of green securitization backed by the ECB, it's essentially the same idea. That is, you use the power of the central bank to do some kind of credit guidance or credit incentivization for the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisabeth.
Yes, first of all, I wanted to react to Mr. Buti on the country-specific recommendations, and I think it's encouraging to hear that there's already things moving, and as you mentioned, recommendation on shifting taxation from labor to environment, and I think that's really the place where we could integrate the SDGs in a much more systematic way. And then on the fiscal sustainability, I think it's encouraging to hear from an economist that fiscal sustainability and environmental sustainability can go together, and I hope the same is true for social sustainability. And I think it's very encouraging to see that the debate on green and sustainable public and private finance is advancing. But what I miss a bit in the debates on sustainable finance and on the debates on and different taxonomies and so on is And I think the SDGs can help there. We cannot neglect or should not neglect the social dimension when we talk about sustainable finance, and at least we should have really a focus on inequality. Otherwise, we will just continue, I think, dividing the society. And then maybe more from a personal note on stagnation and low growth, I think I'm part of the generation that started its studies and came on the labor market in a context of crisis and stagnation, low growth. So, and I think what I feel in my generation is that we do not really believe in a narrative that is only focusing on economic growth anymore. And it's not a happy worldview to say, okay, post growth. It's actually it's just the reality we grow up in, and we try to be realistic and say, okay, we are the first generation, I think, for some decades now that are the first that are saying, okay, the world for our children will not be better than for us. And that's because of what our experience with the financial crisis. That's because of our fear of climate change and so on. So just a growth narrative is really not enough, I think, for us, and we need a much richer narrative.
Yeah. I just want to comment on two things. First, on this growth thing. Usually I don't use the word because, well, growth actually is taken as a synonym of well-being, and it is not. And when you say degrowth or post-growth, it's like post-well-being. No, this is not. No, but that's really important. So, yes, I know that we picked the post-growth as the name of the conference. We had a discussion on that. I'm not sure that that's the best approach, because if GDP is the wrong indicator, it is the wrong indicator upwards and it's the wrong indicator downwards, if it doesn't measure what we want. So if what we want is a lower ecological footprint, let's target a lower ecological footprint. If our target is more equality in society, let's target equality in society, right? So let's look at the things we want, rather than as a proxy, which apparently is not the right proxy. So to me, this is why I prefer to shift the debate away from growth, post, before, smart, sustainable, inclusive, and all the rest of it. That's not the topic. And it's hard for politicians, because I will not speak as an economist, but really as a politician. Growth is very comfortable, because when you have that, you can always promise more to everyone, more quantitatively. So that's the most comfortable position to be in as a politician. So maybe you promise 90% more to 1% of the population and 0.00008% to 90% of the population, but it's more. And that makes it comfortable, convenient, I would say. When it comes to more equity in society or reduced ecological footprint, then it becomes difficult, because the key issue is distribution. Equity, and that is difficult. That is difficult, but this is where we need to go. And on the ECB, I agree with you, Gaël, that no, the European Parliament does not have control over the ECB, so we have a dialogue with the ECB. So yes, Draghi and whoever comes next come on a regular basis here, but he is not taking instructions from the European Parliament. And personally, if I look at the treaty, I'm not so uncomfortable with that, as long as the mandate of the ECB is narrow. So if we have a narrow mandate, well, actually there's not a lot of space for trade-offs, and therefore I'm happy with having an independent central bank. If you give a broader mandate to the ECB, then you allow for political choices, and I want these political choices to be politically accountable. So to me, the choice is between narrow mandate and independence, and broad mandate and dependence. And to me, I'm comfortable with the first one. The one thing I am not comfortable with, and Marco, I don't know whether you are going to agree with that, but this provision in the treaty that prohibits, I say prohibits, the central bank to lend directly to government, to me is a neoliberal choice, because it presupposes that money creation in favor of government will be badly used, because the government is a poor allocator of resources, which is what neoliberal ideology says. Conversely, lending directly to private banks is okay because at face value, private banks are good allocators of resources. And I think that this provision is one of those provisions that allow, say, leftist anti-Europeans to say, look at these treaties. These are neoliberal in design. Actually, there's many other things in the treaties. But this is a typically neoliberal provision in the treaty. And in my view, we should lift that prohibition, which does not translate into an obligation. So we are not writing in the treaty, we oblige central banks to lend directly to states. But once you create the possibility for central banks to lend to governments, you create market discipline. Why? Because if you're BNP Paribas and you want to have the business of lending to the French state and you know that the French state could possibly go to the ECB if you're asking too much, well, then you will probably police yourself a bit. So I want to create that competition. And again, I noticed that many self-described liberals hate competitions. They like market competition for others. But what they seek, and especially neoliberals, not pure liberals, but pure liberals are really few and far between. But neoliberals are friends of the rent, of rent seekers. They are not friends of profit-rewarding, value-creating activities for society. And this is where I do make a difference. And, well, that's a personal view, but again, real liberals are few and far between. Back to the floor. So we still have time. The lady in white.
I had a question for Mr. Buti. You stressed one point a lot in your presentation, that prior to the crisis, the public finances and whether or not there was this equilibrium determined whether some countries were on one side of the line or the other. And I wanted to ask you if you agreed with what Mr. Philippe Lamberts just said about the ECB being able to lend money, and also what Mr. Giraud said about the necessity for a real paradigm shift in the macroeconomic theory, because to me, the way the Greek crisis was handled, I think has much wider implications than we would like to see. When I look back, especially in history, I think mistakes were repeated. I'm thinking after the First World War, at the Treaty of Versailles, when leaders gathered and to discuss the fate of Germany. And Keynes said at the time, let's not crush them, let's be more lenient, because if we destroy the German economy, it will have an impact on all of the European economies. And of course, we saw the consequences of that. No one listened to Keynes. Massive rise in extremism, Hitler, and everything which followed. And today, when I look at the parallels, what happened in Greece, of course, the voice of Keynes wasn't around, but Social Democrats and Greens, others, asked for more leniency for the Greeks. But instead, the economy was, I think, fair to say, crushed. Very strict measures were imposed. And today we see a rise in extremism all across Europe. Now, a lot of people say that this is due to migration crisis. And I don't think that's the main reason. I mean, neither the EU institutions nor the European governments wanted this crisis. It's just happening to us because we're located geographically close to a war zone. But we certainly did not want this, and no one wants to be in a position of having to refuse access to an asylum seeker to Europe. I think that for a lot of people, seeing what happened in Greece triggered a huge amount of fear, because truth is that no human being is insensitive to seeing another one suffer, except for narcissists, of course, who have the incapacity for empathy. But seeing what happened in Greece, all these banks being shut down, people not being able to withdraw money, riots and violence, massive rise in unemployment, I think affected a lot of people deeply and raised the question, am I going to be subject to this in the future? Will my country be subjected to what the Greeks were subjected to? Which then, you know, as one feels fear, one then tries to regain control, and one tries to distance himself from what is perceived to be the inflictor of pain. In this case, you can say Troika, the EU institutions, Brussels, but there is, I think, a need was created in a lot of people to regain this control, and now wanting to vote for people or leaders who have a rebellious stand against Brussels, hoping that by voting for these people, they will be protected and they will stand firm against the evil forces of Brussels, which is a tragedy because Brussels is actually working for the well-being of European citizens. We're all here trying to improve the lives of the EU citizens, and instead, a lot of people are seeing Brussels as a source of danger. I mean, if I had to diagnose what's happening in Europe, I would say it's like we're having, there's an autoimmune disease. For those who don't know, it's like when the immune system of a body...
Can you conclude?
Yeah. So the question is, to conclude, yes, of course. Are we going to make this change in the theories, or are we just going to carry on with these theories, which neoliberal austerity policies, which to me were clearly did not yield the right results? Thank you.
Thank you. Other? Yeah, Nadine.
Yes. My name is Nadine Gouzet. I've been working 2 decades in energy economics and energy accountancy and the connection between the introduction of renewables in the GDP and all these statistical issues. That's why I went to the conference of Rio, and when I came back from Rio, I changed completely my career and began to work on sustainable development strategy for 20 years. I think it's interesting, it's important to say that because the points I would like to address, the first one is the sentence you said, Philippe, and also Mr. Giraud, GDP does not measure what we want. My second question would be about the inconsistency of the 17 SDGs and carbon pricing, which has been also touched upon by your presentation. The GDP does not measure what we want. I must say I do not agree with that. I think that GDP measures economic activities. It's an economic indicator, including some good activities related, good and bad activities. And if we are not happy about the evolution of GDP, if there are correlations between GDP and carbon emissions, because most of our carbon activities are correlated with carbon emissions. But killing the indicator is not the solution. And I compare that to, I worked a lot with Matthijs Wackernagel on the ecological footprint. You could say that exactly for the ecological footprint does not measure what we want. Because you have a lot of ecological disaster which are not taken into account by the ecological footprint. And the ecological footprint in many regards does not cover only a very small part of ecology. So I think that in order to be understood in a democracy, it's very important not to take wrong targets. Now, why do I address the question of inconsistency of the 17 SDG? Because I think that, yes, of course, I recognize it's not a perfect system, but there is a trade-off between legitimacy and inconsistency. And these days, the multilateral system is not very much valued or taken into account. It's and the legitimacy of the adoption of the SDGs, I think, should not be questioned. It's very fragile. It's very weak. But it's more. These SDGs have not been adopted by World Bank or FMI and so on. They come from the UN process. There are many critics on this outcome, but here we are in the European Parliament, and the things produced by this Parliament are far from being perfect as well. So let's take into account the 17 SDG, and as we are aware, like many people said here, that there are trade-offs between different aspects of sustainability. There are certainly trade-offs between the 17 SDGs. The question, as you said, is how do we use them? And my point is that they are a good tool to begin a discussion resulting in a change of paradigm, even including the SDG related to growth, because it's not growth, it's sustainable growth. So it's not only sustainable growth, I agree and I regret it, but it's sustainable growth and not sustained growth. So there is no real contradiction, otherwise it would not have been adopted, because there were enough opposition to simply adopting the objective of sustained growth, and there is a lot on our agenda to work about these issues. And personally, I think that sustainable development is an oxymoron, but this conference as well. I mean, when you read the name of the conference, Post-Growth Conference in European Parliament, in its way, it's an oxymoron, because it looks like, you know, the post-growth, the European Parliament agrees on working on post-growth, and it's not the case. It's a clever minority of it, I would say. I think we should all accept and be happy to work about contradictions, including the ones which are in the SDG list, and the examples which were given are only first steps. And I hope that the European Commission, which is very, very late on that agenda, will soon begin to address the need of a sustainable development strategy dealing with all these goals, including growth, sustainable and sustained.
Okay, there were two ladies there. I take the two of you, and then we have to go back to our panelists. So.
Hi, mine is more of a comment. I'd like to go back to basics, as you started. So if we think of the European Union's construction, it was about peace. It was about promoting peace after the war through trade. But also there was the European Union has been created since the beginning with a belief that a strong focus on economy, because there was a strong belief that if economy is well, society will be fine. And the well-being of society depends on the well-functioning of economy. Now, what we see in all the debates that have been happening today and yesterday is that growth doesn't necessarily allow a sustainable and well-being of society. So maybe we should just go back to basics, and we should really focus on the sustainable society. And so I have a kind of a provocative proposal for the Commission, is to transform DG Grow with DG Sustainable Society, with clear indicators that focus on that directly instead of purely economic indicators first. It's a bit of a provocation, but I think it's important to state that.
Yes, I want to insert also a little bit of a positive point on the SDGs and the interactions. Sorry. I think we have been talking a lot about inconsistencies, but I would also like to highlight a few positive initiatives that have been executed by the European Commission lately as this multi-stakeholder platform for implementing the SDGs, which brings together a lot of very different groups. And I think we have interesting also scientific evidence that we don't only have negative interactions, but also many positive interactions. So I think there is one interesting meta study coming up, which will be part of the UN report on sustainable development, which is currently prepared by the scientific group for the next UNGA meeting, that out of over 1,000 interactions, actually over 800 have been positive. The question is, what are we doing with the trade-offs of the negative interactions that have been identified? And for us, also coming from the civil society, I work for the social platform, is how to negotiate those trade-offs in a transparent way, and and how to involve everybody in the process. I think we have not even started talking about this point. So I think while the evidence is emerging, we don't really have ways to approach this more transparency level of Agenda 2030. And my question actually is, I think whenever we need to manage trade-offs, we need to be coherent. And I think policy coherence for sustainable development is a key dimension and a key enabling framework. And not to unearth too much the European semester, but I would still like to know, and I think maybe it's not necessarily that the European semester needs to be overburdened, but we have seen very strong inconsistencies between economic, social, environmental goals, including in the country-specific recommendation, that stem from a silo and silo thinking and institutional architecture that I think could be improved. And my question would be, what could be learned from the timid steps and the timid socialization of the European semester if we are to be given a message to the leaders, for example, in the run-up to the Sibiu summit, and the next Commission, in how to actually increase the policy coherence with a view on the post-2020 implementation and the governance mechanism.
Okay, thank you. To Nadine, when I say ecological footprint, I didn't mean the indicator. I said I thought just we want to reduce our ecological impact, however you measure it. But I was not using a specific indicator, so I'm not especially in love with that one. So, Marco, you had actually a lot of questions directed to you, I think.
Okay, let me take something easy, something difficult. Now, I think on the, let me start with the last one on the country-specific recommendations. I think we have tried in the past several years to ensure the consistency of country-specific recommendation. You may have specific examples where we have failed on that, but we have tried, by putting together the different services and try to come up with a consistent story and coherence of the way we read the country, the country policy predicament. We have the country reports that provide the analytical basis for that, and the country-specific recommendations are derived from that. What we had, in the implementation of the semester we faced as a dilemma for us is, should we go comprehensive or should we target very in a very specific way? And you have arguments on both sides. One would want to be comprehensive because we know that to tackle the structural bottlenecks of a certain economy, then you have to have many dimensions. So the temptation there would be to cover a lot of ground. At the same time, we know that you list many priorities, you have basically no priorities. So in the past years, the tendency has been to, let's say, narrow down the number of country-specific recommendations, avoid to have a proliferation of sub-recommendation within each one, to make sure that we target the problems in a more specific way, accepting that we miss some of the key dimensions. So, but you may have examples of inconsistency. What actually worry me more is the fact that even though there has been some improvement in the past years, ownership remains very, let's say, limited on this. I mean, the process of adopting the country-specific recommendation involves the European Council endorsement. This came in June. There was basically not a discussion or even 1 minute on this. Okay, there was a migration package. I understand that, but even without the migration package, it would have been, adopted without any discussion. The issue here, ownership, seems to be particularly important on that. Now, on maybe on the issue of austerity and Greece, we have had, as European institutions, Commission in particular, a very tough time, and during the period of the crisis, we were confronted with, as I mentioned at the beginning, with different narratives, different interpretations of the crisis, and we came forward with a number of proposals on the response to the crisis, including the very first expansionary fiscal policies in 2008-2009, which at least helped at the beginning to lessen the effect of the crisis. But we were basically in a crossfire from the two sides. On the one hand, we were the agents of austerity for a number of countries in trouble, and on the others, we were those who fostered moral hazard and bailouts. So critics from the south first, critics from the north the second. So I think a bit of sympathy is expected here. So it was a very difficult situation, and we did that also having entered the crisis with a set of tools which was clearly incomplete. So we did not have the crisis management set of response mechanisms which we had to set in whilst we were dealing with the crisis. So it has been mentioned several times, fixing the engine of the plane while flying, which is not a very comfortable and a very efficient thing to do. So I think and what I mentioned at the beginning, the plan towards the European Council and the Euro Area Summit in December with some deliverables, and then the discussions which I hope will take place in the run-up to the European elections on fixing and completing the architecture of EMU, which would make the whole system much more resilient and robust to a crisis. The case of Greece is, I understand, in the debate is a muted one, and I fully understand and I have a lot of personal sympathy for what you have said. Okay, let me say, first of all, that we had several countries which ran into trouble and which had to take very difficult measures and make very difficult reforms. The Greece case stands apart, and you have had others where you had the J-curve system, let's say, resilient. This is the case of my comments. Okay. But the recovery has been considerably quicker, and now actually they are poster children for the rest also, and all the losses that were incurred during the first part of the crisis have actually been offset, and more than offset. The case of Greece was a very difficult one. I have to say it is a pity, and it's an element of also bad luck, that the Greek case came first amongst the others, because it tainted the interpretation of the crisis that I mentioned at the beginning. It gave a twist in main stakeholders, especially one, in the discussion in the Council, which allowed to identify the crisis essentially as a fiscal one. And in the case of Greece, it was a fiscal crisis. It was a major fiscal crisis. Then the fiscal crisis, they are never only public finances, because what we have done, having gone into the country and having run the program, actually we realized that there was much more to be fixed than that. But when you find yourself from almost literally from one day to another, from a deficit target of 2.7% of GDP to all of a sudden discovering that we had a 15+% of deficit and having lost market access, had the country not been there to be rescued by the support of the rest of Europe, it would have had to slash 15% of GDP public spending, in one go, with the suffering which would have been a multiple of what has happened. Now, does it mean that we have implemented the program all without faults? Definitely not. I think we need to have a post-mortem on this where we can learn a lot. But I think the simple characterization and the finger pointing that the crisis and the suffering is due to the programs and to the Euro institutions, I think misses largely the point.
Thank you. I would not call it a post-mortem, maybe to avoid further anger. Actually, we should have stopped 4 minutes ago, so I'll give Gaël and Elisabeth a few minutes to come back to some of the questions. But then we need to be 2 floors below at 4 for the final plenary.
Okay, thank you, Philippe. So very quickly, on the question of Greece, just 2 remarks. The first one is that if you agree, and the IMF did, that there is a multiplier when you have a public spending, that is, if the government spends €1, then the impact on GDP is higher than €1. Let's say, for simplicity, 1.5. Then it means that if you reduce public spending by €1, the impact on GDP will be also higher than €1. So GDP will reduce by more than €1. Let's say 1.5. So if you try to reduce the ratio public debt over GDP by reducing public spending, and if the multiplier are higher than 1, you will just increase the ratio. GDP, sorry?
It's mechanical.
It's mechanical. So GDP will decrease faster than the public debt. And as you see today, the public debt over GDP ratio of Greece is not lower than it was at the beginning of the crisis. So that's why there is a big question we should ask on the austerity program. From the beginning we knew, some economists knew that it would not work. A second remark is that, in 2001, Greece entered into the Eurozone. We know today that at this time the public accounting of Greece was false, was falsified with the help of Morgan Stanley at this time. It seemed, apparently, Eurostat saw it and said it. So Greece should not have entered the Eurozone in 2001. When I discovered this, I asked a number of my friends from the European Commission who were working at this time and who were advocating for the entry of Greece into the Eurozone. Did you know that the accounting were wrong? And they promised, no, we didn't know. So there was a big mistake. Who bears the fault on this mistake? I don't know, because people from Eurostat are claiming we did our job, but apparently we were not listened to. But there was a big mistake from the beginning. And Greece is the unique country, so far as I know, for which France said, it's a very good idea that Greece should enter into the Eurozone. Whereas for all the other countries, France, remained neutral, at least for France. On the GDP issue, I'm sorry, I still believe that GDP is a bad indicator. Let me just give you 2 examples for that. We all think in terms of real GDP, not nominal GDP. Real GDP is computed this way. Suppose that you have a very simple economy with, let's say, oranges and tomatoes. Last year, you compute the nominal GDP last year. You want to know the growth of real GDP this year in comparison to last year. You compute the nominal GDP this year. You see the increase of the price level average price level, and you assume that the relative prices between tomatoes and oranges today are the same as last year, and you say, well, the growth of GDP was the nominal GDP divided by the general level, the increase on general level prices. But of course, every 2 days, relative prices are moving. So from a strictly economic viewpoint, the real GDP is nonsensical. You see what I mean? That's the first point. Second point, you have a number of things that contribute to the growth of GDP which don't make sense, economically speaking. And for instance, in 2014, OECD suggested that we should introduce prostitution in the computation of the GDP, just to make GDP grow. I'm wondering whether this makes sense. But at a simple level, if you have a bubble on real estate in a country like in a city like Brussels or Paris or now Berlin, since it's starting, this increases GDP. Doesn't change anything in the reality of economic processes. But the very fact that people are allowed to sell a house twice the price it had last year, which is just a rent situation, as Philippe said, increased GDP. Same story for the financial bubble. The very fact that you can sell a financial asset twice its price this year in comparison to its price last year increases GDP. Are we sure this is what we want to measure? I'm not. Of course, I did not say we should give up SDGs, indicators. Or maybe I misunderstood your point. I never said we should give up SDGs. What I'm saying is that I'm not sure that they are consistent. And it's funny because Matthias Baccanaga wrote a paper saying that we are not sure that SDGs are sustainable in the sense that they're not consistent. So it's a real question. Let me just give you an example. Water versus energy. So you have a goal which says we should provide water to everybody, and another goal which says we should provide cheap energy to everybody. As you know, in order to have energy today, we need a lot of water, whatever the way you want to have energy. So there is a nexus in a lot of countries between water, energy, and I would add even minerals. In order to have the three, it's very complicated. You need a lot of water, a lot of energy, and a lot of minerals. My experience at the French Development Agency is that the countries where we will be able to solve this nexus are very few. Maybe the US. In a lot of other countries, you won't have the three items, or at least energy and water. You won't have both at the same time. So how do you want to implement the two goals at the same time? It's a real issue. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying we should think about it and not be entirely naive. I'm saying this because the United Nations in 2015, when they published the SDGs, said, and they're right, it's systemic. We should not favor one SDG, one goal against the other. They all depend upon each other, which is true. And so this makes the entire story very complicated. That's all what I want to say. But maybe we agree on that. And last word, because it's a side aspect of your question. It seems to me, the way I heard your question, you are asking for a positive narrative. It seems to me the ecological transition is a positive narrative for politics and economics in Europe today. Implementing the ecological transition creates a lot of jobs, gives sense for the new generation. What kind of society do we want to deliver for our children? We'll just save a number of small villages in the countryside which are just desperately empty, etc., etc. I mean, that's just a beautiful politically positive narrative that we have in front of us, it seems to me.
Yes. Just a quick note on the comment on the fear that we have in Europe and the austerity. I think it's not only about the austerity debate, austerity or not. Even if we are in the situation today and that we are in today, and even if there are more voices in favor of austerity than others, then we can still think about. So if we have to do certain measures or cut spending, then at least let's have impact assessments to ensure that we do not, with these cuts in spending, we do not compromise our strategic medium-term goals. But for this, you also asked the question, where are we heading? For this, we need these goals, and we have as you said, the EU 2020 with all its successes and failures. We have the monitoring in the European semester, but 2020 is tomorrow. So what's next? I think we have to start thinking about what's next. Will there be a 2030 strategy, and where are we heading? I think that's a good question. And on the inconsistency of SDGs, again, even if I rather agree with Gaël, Giraud on GDP as an indicator, I really get your point on the trade-off between legitimacy and inconsistency. That's very much my feeling when I went to the high-level political forum, which is the main forum for the follow-up of the SDG agenda in New York. The feeling was, even though when I was speaking to NGOs, even though some of them are very skeptical of growth being in this agenda or very aware of these inconsistencies, they say even if it's not a perfect agenda, it's like the only ship standing that gives at least some kind of positive narrative on globalization today. So even if they're not completely happy, they kind of stick to it. But they maybe stick more to it than countries do. And what I observe a lot, like the last two years when I went to this forum, is that it's really losing credibility. Because these initial idea of the SDGs that rich and poor countries should do the same efforts towards this agenda, that's not really working out. And what I find interesting is, although the SDGs kind of were a diplomatic success for the EU and for EU countries, because they really are about a welfare state model and a narrative about energy transition that is very close to European values. So it was a big diplomatic success for the EU, but today the EU is not there to give the leadership on this agenda. So they're losing, I think, because there's not this leadership from the EU and EU countries. I think this agenda is losing credibility, and we have to watch out for that, especially for us. We always say that in 2019, in 2019, this forum will be under the auspices of the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, and for us it's a bit a critical test because it's the completion of the first 4-year cycle of this agenda, and I think that's really a critical test. If we don't have like a real leadership from some countries at that moment, then I don't know where this agenda is heading. And leadership for me also means we need interpretation of this agenda, which by that provide such an interpretation on, okay, what do we really need to do first? Yes, I think that's it.
Thank you. Well, actually, we are now 1 minute late. I suggest a round of applause for our speakers, and then you rush to the second floor for the plenary.